There is something we have to clear up right now, and it's the DNA topic in the Morphew case. The DNA that's not Barry Morphew's, but the DNA that was found and fought over in court by the defense. The DNA of an offender, but it's not what you think it is. People are getting it so very wrong, and we need to sort it out before I go bananas. I'm Linda with It's a Crime, so now let's get into it. Suzanne Morphew was reported missing on May 10th of 2020. Her husband, Barry Morphew, was arrested on May 5th of 2021. He was charged with first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, tampering with the physical evidence, possession of a dangerous weapon, and attempted influence of a public servant. His case, though, was dismissed in April of 2022, just days before his trial was set to begin, but it was dismissed without prejudice, meaning charges can be filed again at a later date. Suzanne's remains were then found in September of 2023, 45 miles south of their home. And recently, on April 29th of 2024, the results from her autopsy were made public. And I'll have that video down below and at the end. And it's looking like the fingers are pointing and leading right back to Barry yet again. But there were comments below that recent video that is misinformation and we need to sort it out. There were two areas of focus for DNA sampling in the case, besides DNA from the family members. Number one, the area of the Morphew home and Suzanne's vehicle. Number two, the alleged crime scene where Suzanne's bike was found near the home. Barry had suggested that Suzanne went for a bike ride the morning of Mother's Day when she was reported missing and never seen again. But this case has not been straightforward. There have been a lot of complications and confusion. Authorities touched the bike, there were issues in court, and Barry's defense attorney, who's a shark, and I've mentioned that before, she was complaining that the authorities and the prosecution should be looking at a sex offender from DNA results instead of pointing the finger at her client, Barry Morphew. And we'll get to that in a minute, but let's first talk about the evidence with DNA. There were 65 pieces of evidence, including DNA buccal swabs, aka cheek swabs, from the Morphew family and Suzanne's brother, Andy Mormon, and others as well. Note, there was no workable DNA that was recovered from the bobcat blade, which Barry had swapped out the day that the authorities believe Suzanne was murdered. Barry claimed he was shooting chipmunks that day, but the authorities believe that he was chasing Suzanne around the house with a tranquilizer gun. As for the bobcat, more confusion, as cadaver dogs was said to have hit on the seat of Barry's bobcat, but nothing further was done about that, and nothing was hit on for the dryer inside the house as well. But here's what they did have DNA results on: Suzanne's bike. The DNA on her bike seat included a mixture of 4 people, Suzanne being the primary, with Barry and one of the responding Chaffee County Sheriff's personnel being included. The 4th male is said to be unknown. The DNA on the bike grips of the bike included a DNA mixture of 4 people as well, Suzanne and a sergeant being primary contributors. Barry was excluded as a contributor, but it was said that Suzanne had her bike tires serviced recently, and the DNA on the bike brakes and handlebars included a mixture of 4 people. Suzanne and 2 deputies were primary contributors. Barry was excluded. Again, nothing on the 4th. Now to her bike helmet, which, by the way, was found in a different area. It was found west of the house and the so-called crime scene, about a mile from the home. The interior cushions of the helmet were tested for DNA and a partial profile was developed. It was said that the mixture was more likely to involve Barry and Suzanne's DNA than coming from anyone else, and it was said it was by a factor of 6.2 times. So it's a strong likelihood that both Barry and Suzanne's DNA were mixed in this helmet. Now let's talk about the house. In the dryer of the Morphew residence, there was a plastic cap belonging to a needle that is used to inject chemicals into a tranquilizer dart that was found and tested for DNA. A low-level partial DNA mixture of 2 people were recovered, with Suzanne's DNA being one of them, and Barry was excluded as a contributor. A dart needle was collected in a box in the garage, and it was swabbed, and a partial DNA profile was developed with Barry included as the contributor with moderate support. Now let's talk about Suzanne's vehicle, her Land Rover. The front driver door of her 2015 white Land Rover was tested, and the DNA was consistent with samples from Barry and Suzanne. But investigators testified that there was male DNA that was found on the glove box of Suzanne's vehicle and the rear passenger seat. The information wasn't included in Barry's arrest affidavit, but it later came out in court. And this male DNA was said to be a partial match in a system called CODIS. And it happened to be that the person who is in the database was and is a sex offender in Arizona. In Phoenix and Tempe, there were cases, and Chicago. And later it was revealed that this person moved to Arizona. One interesting side note about Arizona, Barry actually mentioned to Suzanne they should move to Arizona before she went missing. I find that interesting. Now, CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. Think of it as a giant database used by law enforcement agencies, and it stores DNA profiles from people who have been convicted of crimes, as well as DNA samples from crime scenes. And here's how it works. When a crime occurs, investigators collect DNA evidence from the scene. They can then compare this evidence to the DNA profiles stored in CODIS. If they find a match, it can help them identify a suspect or link the crime to other cases. And imagine how helpful that can be. So imagine you have a puzzle and you find a piece that almost fits perfectly in the puzzle you're trying to solve. But because it's partial, it's not an exact match, but it's close. That's what a partial match is in CODIS. When there's a partial match, it means that the DNA profile from the crime scene doesn't exactly match any profiles already in the database, but it's pretty darn close. And according to CODIS, a partial match occurs when search is conducted and the results clearly show that the offender profile is not the source of the crime scene profile, also referred to as a forensic profile. But the possibility does exist that a close biological relative of the offender might be the source of the crime scene profile. And now there's something also called high stringency search. And what that means, in simple terms, is that CODIS is being very strict or careful when comparing these DNA profiles to find a match. It's like having a strict set of rules or criteria that must be met before declaring a match. This ensures that only very close matches are considered, making the identification process more accurate and reliable. In a moderate stringency search, CODIS is still looking for matches, but it's not as strict as in a high search. This means that it might consider a broader range of possibilities when comparing DNA profiles, including matches that are not as close. While it allows for more flexibility in finding potential matches, it also increases the chance of including false positives or matches that aren't as accurate. So a partial match is a clue for investigators. It's not an exact match. And this male DNA wasn't found in the Morphew home, and it wasn't found on the helmet or the bike. It was found in Suzanne's car only. And did Suzanne even drive that day? So this partial match is a relative of the person in CODIS. I've talked about this before. Think of it this way. You get a DNA sample done for Ancestry for personal reasons. You send it off, they collect and analyze your data, and when they're done, you get matched to relatives. Ancestry doesn't say we found you, it says we found relatives based on your DNA that you submitted. Now, one more thing, since this match is a relative, it may be a close relative depending on the parameters that they set in the database. And since it's male, a brother, an uncle, a nephew, a first cousin would be the match. You know what I mean? So when high parameters are set, close relative. Not so high, it starts getting muddy results. So how would an investigator use this clue? They can create a family tree starting with these two matches, the guy in the database and the sample they collected from the car. They build out the tree They start narrowing it down and find out who the match is. Now, it would be a lot easier, of course, if it was a brother, a nephew, an uncle, and would be harder as it branches out to cousins, as you have to start matching them with grandparents, and that can get extensive depending on how many children they had. Once they start narrowing it down, they interview the person and they go from there. If we go a step further, there's something called alleles. And imagine alleles as different versions of a gene, just like how you can have different flavors of ice cream, like chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry. And alleles are variations of genes that determine specific traits. In genetics, there's often talk about dominant and recessive alleles or traits. And dominant alleles are like the bossy flavors of ice cream. They always show up, even if there's just one of them. On the other hand, recessive alleles are more laid back. They only show up if there are two of them together. For example, let's take the gene for hair color. Say there's a dominant allele for brown hair and a recessive allele for blonde hair. If someone has one dominant allele for brown hair and one recessive allele for blonde hair, their hair will be brown because the dominant allele is stronger. But if someone has two recessive alleles for blonde hair, then their hair will be blonde because there are no dominant alleles to overpower them. And alleles can also be hair color, blood type, height, and skin color. And when it comes to CODIS, alleles play a crucial role in creating DNA profiles. CODIS looks at specific genetic markers, which are like signposts along the DNA, and they check which alleles are present at each marker. These alleles are compared between different DNA samples to see if they match up. So if a person's relative, like a sibling or parent, is in the CODIS database, there's a chance their DNA profile will share some alleles with the crime scene DNA. This creates a partial match. So the match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to raise doubt. And the problem in court was it was pushed as a perfect or an exact match and not a partial match. And while the witnesses on the stand stated it as partial, the prosecution didn't fight back on it, and the defense used that ignorance and pushed to raise doubt, or they didn't understand it either. So now in the comments of my last video, everyone believes that the male DNA partial match is a sexual predator from Arizona and Chicago, which is incorrect and very frustrating. So imagine that a person didn't understand this scenario and authorities come knocking at your door and accusing you of all kinds of things when really it's your cousin in another state. It's a very stark difference and a very grave mistake. And here's the other problem. Investigators at that time in court didn't follow up on this lead, making it look worse when in reality it needed to be clarified in court. Also, with what investigators already had on Barry Morphew, I can see how this would be a nothing burger to them. But yet there still should have been follow-up or it be clarified. And perhaps this DNA in Suzanne's car was a mechanic. And when was that DNA put there? When they bought the vehicle? An oil change? Who knows? Even news sources were claiming there was a link to this sex offender, but some saying it was even 3 profiles. It is frustrating. Let me know your thoughts below. And even a defense attorney unrelated to the case spoke about this and said, if such a DNA profile was found in a missing woman's car and that DNA profile belongs to a sex offender, the lack of an explanation for how that profile got into the car of the missing woman would certainly provide a basis for a reasonable doubt and that someone else committed the crime. This, my friends, is all a red herring. And now, with the new information about Suzanne and finding a cocktail of vet drugs in her body, it leads back to Barry Morphew, aka Bear Bear, and he even admitted to using these drugs to shoot deer to collect their horns, as he called it, not antlers. But found also at the scene of Suzanne's remains was a balaclava. So I'd love to know if that's being tested for DNA and what will it come back with. In In my opinion, it was planted, and I feel like Suzanne's body was moved to the location, and that wasn't her original location. Oh, and by the way, there were a ton of discrepancies with Barry Morphew, and he said he covered 200 square miles of searching for his wife around the house. Oh? Did you miss that area, Barry? Or was that the new spot to create a new narrative? He didn't want you to look in that area south of where he stood in an interview with Tyson Draper, and that, to him, had already been searched. That area. Don't go looking there. Check out my video on the new evidence in the case right here, and check out right here what YouTube thinks you may like. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.